Hello, this is Jerry. Welcome back to our studies in the Old Testament book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah, as the new governor, enlisted the Jews in the area to put them to work on the Jerusalem walls. And today, we'll be using our time machine a lot, and if you hang with me until the end, I'll come to a spiritual point. This verse leaped out at me this week. After him, Nehemiah, son of Azbuk, that's a different Nehemiah, ruler of half the district of Beth-zur, repaired to a point opposite the tombs of David. This verse focuses on the workers in the southern region, where I've put this red star. You could see it on the bottom there. And there is mentioned the tombs of David, the royal cemetery. Nehemiah's mention of these tombs of David really piqued my interest, but I had no idea how deep and yet intriguing this topic was. Now, we know that the original city of David comprised only about 12 acres. The entire New Hope campus here is over 20 acres, if you go to our church. Not unusual for a town then, about 1000 B.C. David didn't create this town, but God gave him a military victory over the Jebusites, including this military fortress of Jebus, as in Jebusites, 1 Samuel 5. And you can see here, just north, was what the Old Testament calls the mountain of the Lord, Mount Moriah, where Abraham had offered his son Isaac, and the Lord said no, but provided a ram instead. So in David's time, 1,000 years after Abraham, the mountain of the Lord, of course, was still sacred, and David paid Araunah for the spot, which was a threshing floor to sift grains, 2 Samuel 24. And according to 2 Chronicles 3:1, Solomon built the temple right on that sacred Mount Moriah place, which is what a great place for the temple, which pictured the sacrifice of the Messiah as the Lamb of God to take away our sins. So David and others expanded Jerusalem in time. 1 Corinthians 2:10 tells us David was buried in the city of David, which began a royal cemetery of the house or lineage of David, Solomon, and the kings of Judah. So Nehemiah 3:16 provides a more specific location within the city of David for these tombs. Now we would think that with the small size of the city of David and with this more specific location in Nehemiah, that this royal cemetery would be a cinch to find. Not so. It's complicated. So we need to be Bible scholars, historians, archaeologists, and sleuths to figure this mystery. Well, let's give it a try. The burial of King David in 970 B.C. begins the royal cemetery. This is our almost blank canvas, so let's fill it up. Then Nehemiah 3:16 in the 440s B.C. noted the tombs of David. Now we've been hovering over the perimeter walls of Jerusalem with this map. What is in this area of the tombs of David geographically? Does it even have a place conducive for the kind of stone tombs they hewed into or carved out for a tomb? And they didn't bury their nobles and kings like we do. Well, rather than just tell you, let's quick ride with Google Maps and see for ourselves. Here is a section of modern Jerusalem on the right, and I have very imperfectly hand-drawn an outline that approximates the original city of David. I do this with a mouse, and so it's not easy. On the top middle, we can see the Dome of the Rock, Muslim mosque, right on top of the original Jewish temple. Not a coincidence. Note the main street through that original southern part is called City of David Street. So we're in the right place. The marker we want to find in the south is the Pool of Siloam, which we can see on the left ancient map. And fortunately, they know where that is today, so we need to find it and then look 2 o'clock northeast, not far, about 100 to 150 yards, to the tombs of David. Now, I want to gradually zoom in to see this Nehemiah 3:16 area. And again, let's get closer. And look, now we see in very small print at the bottom, Pool of Siloam. All right, we're at the most southern part of the city of David. Now, 2 o'clock northeast, we notice this big, long, tan area. What is that? Well, let's get closer. That tan area is within the City of David National Park, so no residential homes there, and this is all bedrock stone. I can go one more closer here before it starts to blur out. So within the area Nehemiah noted was a large bedrock stone area, perfect for carving tombs into. But was this where the cemetery was? Hold that thought. We'll come back to that. Now, let's switch from geography to history and move forward about 310 years after Nehemiah to the next mention of this cemetery in 134 BC by the Jewish high priest John Hyrcanus. This is during the 400 years between the Old and New Testaments. The first century Jewish historian Josephus describes how Hyrcanus, the high priest, when he was besieged by Antiochus, this is Antiochus VII of Syria, was desirous of giving him money to get him to raise his siege and draw off his army, and having no other method of compassing or collecting the money, opened one room of David's sepulchre and took out 3,000 talents. Well, talent is about 75 or 80 pounds of silver, sometimes gold, and gave part of that sum to Antiochus, and by this means caused the siege to be raised. So he bought off the invading army. Josephus was normally a reliable historian, and we have no reason to doubt this account, which means that at least some people knew where the tombs were, and unlike Egyptian royal tombs, they were not almost immediately plundered by locals. Here the high priest was regretful to do such a disrespectful thing to David's tomb, though it is interesting he gave part of that sum to Antiochus. Assuming this is a true account, isn't it interesting that in the sovereignty of God, the treasures of David's tomb later saved Israel here? It's an interesting turn. Moving forward again, Josephus also relates that around a century after Hyrcanus, Herod the king opened another room, that is, of David's tomb, and took away a great deal of money. Now we are talking plunder, and Herod was just the kind of person for that. Josephus also writes that Herod returned later and finished looting all the gold furniture and other treasure. Now let's progress 2 generations from Herod the Great to Peter the Apostle. At Pentecost, at around AD 30, he preached, "Brothers, I may say to you with confidence about the patriarch David, that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day." Well, that's interesting. And since David died in 970 BC and it's now around AD 30, we are at around the 1,000-year anniversary of this tomb. And it was still visible and known along with all the other tombs, I'm sure, and well known and visible for Peter to assume that everyone knew this fact. But then came the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who reigned from 117 to 138, and he had a very tumultuous relationship with the Jews. Already the Jews had been pushed out of Jerusalem in the year 70 and their second temple destroyed? Now let me quote about Emperor Hadrian. In 132 CE, Hadrian visited Jerusalem, which was still in ruins from the First Roman-Jewish War of 66 to 73 CE. When he built a temple to Jupiter on the ruins of the Temple of Solomon, the populace rose up under the leadership of Simon Bar Kokhba in what has come to be known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt. Well, we'll return to Hadrian in a minute, but let me insert real quickly another witness. Sometime shortly before this revolt of the Jews from 132 to 136, there is one last mention of one of the tombs by the ancient Roman historian Dio Cassius. Thus nearly the whole of Judea was made desolate, a result of which the people had forewarning before the war. All right, it's talking about this big war that happened in Hadrian's time. What was that forewarning? It was two bad omens. Here they are, according to Dio Cassius. For the tomb of Solomon, which the Jews regard as an object of veneration, fell to pieces of itself and collapsed, and many wolves and hyenas rushed howling into their cities. Well, really bad omens, I guess. Not a propitious time to start a revolt against Rome because of Hadrian and his temple to Jupiter. So about 130 or 131, Solomon's tomb noticeably collapsed. And now the results of this Bar Kokhba revolt. Roman losses in this campaign were enormous. You need to remember that fact, by the way. But Jewish losses were no less significant. By the time the rebellion was put down, 580,000 Jews had been killed and over 1,000 towns and villages destroyed. Wow. Hadrian then banished the remaining Jews from the region and renamed it Syria Palestina after the traditional enemies of the Jewish people, the Philistines. He ordered a public burning of the Torah, executed the Jewish scholars, and prohibited the practice and observance of Judaism. Wow. So the Jews had been pushed out of Jerusalem in AD 70, and now through this war in the 130s, they are chased out of their whole country. And the final touch, Hadrian renamed the land to disassociate the Jews from their historic homeland. But to our study, this is when Emperor Hadrian made a win-win-win move. He needs a lot of stone to rebuild this pagan temple to Jupiter. And Jerusalem he's also rebuilt. So he used some of the stones from the Jewish temple destruction, but he also needs more new stones. And there in the old city of David, right on its edge in the area Nehemiah referred to, was this whole section of bedrock stone that may well have displayed this ancient house of David cemetery. Uh-oh. Hadrian converted that whole area into his quarry, where, number one, he gets all the stone he wants. Number two, he has the pleasure of further harming the Jewish faith by destroying this royal cemetery. And finally, number three, he can plunder any wealth left in those tombs. And then Hadrian successfully built this temple, which stood a few hundred years before Emperor Constantine I tore it down about AD 325. Now, we've seen that the following people have interacted in some way with these visible tombs, right? There was Nehemiah, if you follow the red star around here. Then there was the high priest John Hyrcanus. There was Herod the Great, the apostle Peter, likely Emperor Hadrian, and finally Dio Cassius. Now this area became known as just a Roman quarry, and with the Jewish population gone and the land controlled by Muslim administrations from the 7th century forward, Well, it was inevitable that the tombs of the house of David were forgotten and evidently destroyed by the quarry. Now enter the Crusades of the 11th through the 13th centuries. Crusader knights in Jerusalem, the city of David, felt it almost necessary to possess the tomb of David as a religious relic for God's blessing and help, and to inspire the soldiers. Relics were hugely valued then. Now, they didn't know about that old cemetery location. They erected a burial monument of King David in the Mount Zion area beside the old city of David. The place had some caves underneath, which they claimed held King David. Since then, if you go to Jerusalem, they will show you this monument. Wendy and I saw it back in 1985. While some favor this site, most archaeologists and scholars believe this memorial was an unsubstantiated Crusader claim that inspired them at the time. The Crusaders only held Jerusalem for 2 periods, and it continued under Muslim control. Now let's take a big jump from the Crusaders to the early 20th century, 1913. Jerusalem is still under Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. In 1913, the wealthy Jewish French banker Baron Edmond James de Rothschild purchased this quarry land and some other land, and then sponsored a French Jewish archaeologist, Raymond Weil, to excavate there. It was much easier to receive permission from the Muslim authorities if the person already owned the land, and Rothschild had the money to make this desirable to the Muslim Jerusalem authorities. Now, the goal of the archaeologist Weil was to find the tombs of the king of Judah. He was the first we know of to ignore the whole maze of politics and religion and to use the Bible, which clearly said that the tombs were in the original city of David, and Nehemiah 3:16 narrowed this location even more. He led the first Jewish excavation ever in Jerusalem, and he was the first professional archaeologist to recognize the boundaries of that first city of David. Now, to Weil, this Roman quarry area seemed the most promising place because it fit the area mentioned by Nehemiah. It was right on the edge of the city where you would want a cemetery to be, and all that stone was perfect for tombs. Weil did 2 seasons there in 1913 and 14 before it was interrupted by the outset of the Great War, World War I, and then the second season from 1923 to 1924. So finally, someone with Bible in hand chose to focus on that Roman quarry. Anyone curious as to what he found? Weil found 8 recognizable ancient tombs, despite the Roman quarrying destroying so much. Then one more tomb on his second season, for a total of 9. The largest he dubbed T1, as in Tomb 1, and he speculated that it could be that of David or Solomon. T1 is 54 feet long, 8 feet wide, 6 feet high, and there are 2 levels. Today, many Christian and Jewish and other archaeologists hold that these 9 tombs are probably the surviving tombs from the kings of Judah, or at least they're the best candidate we have. But the quarry tombs of Raymond Weil are not positively the cemetery of David. Unfortunately, the extensive Roman digging in the quarry wrecked what little soil context or pottery that existed around, the stuff that archaeologists would use to date the tombs, because they can't just date a rock. There is also the possibility that the tombs were the burial places of those bad kings who were not honored with placement in David's cemetery, but buried in another cemetery, like King Joash. 2 Chronicles 24 says, "So he died, and they buried him in the city of David," that's important, "but they did not bury him in the tombs of the kings." So there are two cemeteries. Actually, if you look at this map of the site by Vale, it's very possible, as I have worded here, that the tombs of David, the royal cemetery, represented all this in green that was almost completely destroyed by quarry work. And perhaps those fewer smaller tombs on the bottom, tombs 4 to 8 plus one more, maybe these were the second cemetery nearby for those kings who weren't allowed in the royal cemetery. So overall, I agree with many archaeologists that there's a very solid case for these tombs from Hadrian's quarry being a part of the tombs of David. And whether the largest tomb, T1, was for David or Solomon, well, there I have some doubts, because if this is the royal cemetery, then most of the tombs were destroyed by the quarry work, and we don't know their size. So T1 might have been just a medium-sized tomb. We don't know. Plus, I think history lends a voice here. Now, I quoted earlier that the Romans lost a lot of soldiers in their Bar Kokhba war for 4 or 5 years. When Hadrian turned the Jewish venerated cemetery into a quarry, that was personal as well as practical. Hadrian was destroying not only the Jewish people, but paganizing the Jewish temple area, shutting down Judaism, and destroying anything else Jewish. The mentions we read through history of the tombs almost always referred to either David or Solomon's tomb, probably because they're the most noticeable and grand ones. The other ones were there, yes, but David and Solomon's were prominent. Again, Hadrian made that area a quarry when the Roman hatred of Jews was at a fever pitch around that 4 to 5 year war. And so I think it's highly probable that the venerated tombs of David and Solomon were completely obliterated early on by the Romans. High priority. And so I'm thinking T1 maybe was for one of the other kings of Judah. This is just my guess. So we had all these witnesses through the history of the tombs, which were visible until the 2nd century, the 100s. What obscured this? Well, the Roman quarry by Hadrian is a very satisfying answer as to how this cemetery disappeared from view, and how the memory of this cemetery was lost with the expulsion of the Jews by Hadrian, and by the Roman occupation then after, and rebuilding of Jerusalem, and then the Muslim occupation for, well, about 1,300 years following. Oh, that's plenty enough to bury both the view and memory of a royal cemetery. The late Herschel Shanks, one of the great modern archaeologists, founder of the Biblical Archaeology Society and Biblical Archaeology Review magazine, said of the T1 tomb site that it was precisely where one would expect to find this burial site mentioned in Nehemiah 3:16. It perfectly fit what Nehemiah said. All this leads to our main point. This discovery all began at the beginning of the 20th century with two Jewish persons. Both of them believed in the absolute validity of the scriptures and the specific area of the cemetery indicated in Nehemiah 3:16. And that verse was key. The wealthy Baron Rothschild, why, he literally banked on Nehemiah 3:16 being historically true. How often in history have archaeologists depended upon the specific words of the Bible in finding sites? Well, a lot. I've probably mentioned before that Wendy and I were on an archaeological dig on Mount Ebal in Samaria, where the late archaeologist Adam Zertal found the altar of Joshua before entering into the Promised Land. He was a remarkable man. How did he find that? He read the pages of Deuteronomy and Joshua, began walking around that Mount Ebal hilltop area, noticed ancient potsherds being pushed up through the earth, and began digging. Don't you want to be an archaeologist? The witness of the Scriptures as absolutely truthful and correct with respect to history is one of the many miracles that bolsters our faith that this Bible is true in every other way also, which includes all the miracles recorded like the Exodus and the perfect life, death, and resurrection of the Messiah Jesus. It's all true. Now, I'm not basing all this, what I'm saying just now, on Nehemiah 3:16, but on almost countless ways the Scriptures prove to be true. Well, let me word it this way. Nehemiah 3:16 is like one voice within a great choir of the Bible's beautiful voices, singing in lyrical harmony and variety. The majestic Bible resounds with the message of truth, not just spiritual truth with an imperfect wrapping, but truth in all that it says. That is, all the voices within this choir are beautiful and are on pitch. A Bible faulty in its many historical narratives would be a very serious flaw for a book claiming to be true spiritually and to be the authoritative Word of God. Okay, we're back home in our present day. I know, a whirlwind, perhaps exhausting journey. But I hope a meaningful reminder that we have something really very special in our hands with the Bible. Well, next week, Lord willing, the people need to finish building that wall. And here comes the opposition against them with many schemes to halt the work. Let's see what Nehemiah does. Thanks very much.